Yes, of course, my answer is going to be absolutely the church is worth getting up for. And it's not what you've done or what's on your resume that matters, but it's who you are. And we're reminded that God delights in us because he created us, looked at us and said, yeah, that's good. And to be reminded of that, to have some time set apart to just reset every week, like we all need that.
Is church worth waking up for? Can't we just tune into our favorite pastor's podcast or online sermon and get our weekly dose of Jesus right there? First of all, I hope you're getting more than weekly doses of Jesus, but this does bring up a really big question. Do I actually need a church community after graduation, or do I just need Jesus? Well, Gina Cherian, pastor at Hope Community Church in Glenview, Illinois, is going to share why she thinks church absolutely is worth waking up for, what you, alumni, bring to the table that the church really needs right now, and how we can all navigate the sometimes challenging first steps to getting connected with a new faith community. Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele, and this one's for you, alumni. Gina, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
Absolutely. I am really glad to have you. You and I didn't know each other before just 10 minutes ago, and but grateful for Jason Thomas and him getting us connected here. Gina, help us out before we dive into our conversation. Would you help me and help our audience get to know you a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in an Indian American church, and my parents immigrated from India, so our church was full of Indian immigrants, and I was very involved in the church. And what I loved about the church growing up is because our parents were immigrants, as kids growing up here, we had a lot of ownership in our youth group and leadership, and so
nice,
really great, opportunities. But I didn't see people that looked like me, had my experiences in ministry full time. So that wasn't my path to serving in ministry. It was very windy, and I had careers in technology and education before I ended up actually starting in children's ministry. And then I became eventually the campus pastor of a mega church here in the Chicagoland area. And then from there, I'm at my church currently, which is Hope Community Church in Glenview, which is just north of Chicago, a pretty big suburb. On the North Shore.
Okay, that's awesome. So you've had a number of different interesting touch points with the church and church community. You've gotten to see it unfold and interact in some really unique ways, which is perfect because you have a nice history of experience that you can draw from as we talk through kind of our big question that we're leaning into today. And that's just for a little background for you. That's where we're at. We're in a series that's asking big questions, and that's big questions either that we know recent grads are asking or ones that we would recommend that they be thinking about because we don't always know the questions that maybe would be helpful to ask ahead of time. And so today we're asking the question, is church worth getting up for? So that's, I'd love to just start really broadly with you, Gina, and even just ask that question directly and say, if you were sitting across the table from a brand new InterVarsity alum, and they asked you that question, knowing your experiences with the church, how would you answer that question? Is church worth getting up for?
Well, of course, I'm a little biased as a pastor, John.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I brought you on here.
Yes, of course, my answer is going to be absolutely the church is worth getting up for. And I'll tell you that my experiences, one of the things that I have navigated is kind of feeling homeless and trying to figure out how do I find the church that's right for me. It's, wasn't the church I grew up in. And so I've been a part of so many different expressions of the church. And so it's tough sometimes, and it requires some experimenting and figuring out and kind of almost navigating different church cultures and what that looks like. And how do you be yourself in a context that maybe is totally different, from what you've experienced in the past. And so I just acknowledge that. But I would also say, so much of schooling and getting to the point you graduate from college it's based on, there's all these milestones, right? You get grades, you graduate, and there's kind of a very clear pathway. You graduate, and it's so disorienting because that pathway, those milestones, they're all kind of gone, and you just are trying to figure it out. And I would say that the other piece too, that about growing up, and at least the culture I feel like I'm seeing now, is that there's so much, achievement orientation. Like where you go to college now is like a competitive sport, and competitive sports are like jobs. Like, I mean, it's all these different things, and you graduate, and all of a sudden it's, actually feel like it's a great opportunity when you come to church to be reminded that you're not the sum of your achievements, and it's not what you've done or what's on your resume that matters, but it's who you are. And I actually feel like it's a really ripe time to remember that. And so I think, is the church worth getting up for? Yeah, because that's the place we come to every week. We're reminded that we're not who we are, that God delights in us because he created us, looked at us and said, yeah, that's good. And to be reminded of that, to have some time set apart to just reset every week, like we all need that. And so I'd say absolutely church is worth getting up for.
Yeah, I appreciate that you mentioned just like what a stark contrast it is stepping into this new season, because there's so many of those measurable milestones. Yeah. You get down in the weeds of something like, I mean, your exams, your tests, your papers that you're writing, like you get a grade written at the top of your paper,
right,
or put into whatever electronic system that you can go and check and see, where am I landing this year?
Yeah.
And all of that kind of goes out the window when when you move into this new season. And even just the way that we sort of have started kind of gamifying everything that we do, that like, all right, if we can turn this into almost this competition, or you get a badge for completing this kind of thing, it makes people more likely to engage with it. And then you step into a church setting, like there's no real overt checklist of, am I hitting all of the things here? Does this church check all the boxes for me? Have I added boxes that it shouldn't need to worry about? None of it's gamified so that I get badges for participating. It can just, you are really just going in as the human that you are, interacting with other humans in that space and trying to figure out, like, is this the right spot? And I also just like want to acknowledge the fact that you and I were talking about this a little bit before we hit record. And that's just the reality that, like, this generation of college student, of recent grad, they have such a perspective on the world. Like they have eyes on what's happening around the world. And as a result, they also have eyes on ways that the church has failed in ways that so many of us did not have access to, or such easy access to, that I feel like it sort of sets them up for, I mean, to some degree, maybe more realistic expectations, but also maybe anticipating, like, gosh, I'm going to go to this church and I'm going to get hurt, because that's just what happens. Or I'm going to go to this church and we're going to have some significant disconnects on what we think really matters as far as a perspective in the world. And like that can just be really tough entering, before you've even crossed the threshold, wrestling through some of those things in your mind.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's, it's part of my experience is, I was at a large church where there was, very public, large moral failing. And it was one of the most devastating things to me. Was, of course, you see adults and people who've been in the faith for a while navigate that, but it was actually the disillusionment of young people that was the most heartbreaking.
Wow.
Because, there's just so much. And again, I get at that age, there's a lot of idealism around the church. And in some ways, I think this generation is maybe growing up a little more eyes wide open, which can be healthy. And also, like, I see it in myself too, sometimes it can make you more cynical and more standoffish. And that's tough to overcome too. And I get it, because you've seen some real difficult things. And in some ways too, I think it's a reminder that I think we always say, the church is flawed and we're, sinful people. So of course, the church isn't perfect, but that's all great in theory. When you experience that in real life, when you feel really genuinely hurt, it's much harder to navigate. And so I feel for Gen Z in particular and some of those experiences. And I also believe it helps them just have a richer perspective, and also maybe just some good cautions and warnings and thoughtful questions that they can bring to the table that I think actually would be great for the church to hear and pay attention to.
Yeah, well, I would actually love to hear more about your thoughts on some of those kinds of things. You talk about bringing to the table. So I'd love to steer our conversation in that direction, actually, and ask, like, from each party's perspective, like for our Gen Z listeners asking, like, well, what is it that the church brings to the table that are really good for me to have access to? And then the flip side of that, for people, I mean, also for our Gen Z people to hear, like, you have something that you bring to the table that's really good for the church, that this is a mutually beneficial relationship that's going on here. So I wonder, can you speak to just like one or two of those things of like, this is what each party brings that the other one needs, not just for a trade-off, quid pro quo, but for like, we're better together because we bring these things to the table.
Yeah, I think I'll actually start with what I think this generation brings to the table, because I get really excited about that.
Sweet.
It's obviously the gospel never changes, right? But the expression of the church does and looks different from generation to generation. And I kind of grew up in an era where it was bigger is better, right? You think big malls and, chain restaurants and things like that. And now, like, you want to shop online. You don't even want to go into a store if you don't have to, you want to go to like the farm to table, unique restaurant. I mean, and so things have shifted so much. And again, maybe it's kind of where I'm located, but I see those kinds of shifts in the church where a lot of the church in the era that I grew up was like, man, bigger is better. And the more you are doing and accomplishing for God, like, we're going to celebrate that. And you kind of wanted to be a part of something big and that was doing like all these huge things.
Yes.
And, and I see this shift now to people longing for like real community, a real experience of God, like to feel his presence, to feel move of the Spirit, to like be with people together in community and real relationships. And I honestly, like, we're figuring out how to do that. And I think Gen Z, I feel like this next generation has so much to offer in terms of the direction of the church and where are we headed and how does the church need to shift and adapt. And the church is a big institution, so sometimes it's hard to steer that. But I think I look forward to hearing from the next generation. One of the things we've done at our church is a few years ago, our church started during COVID, and we had a lot of students at that time. We started meeting in a forest preserve. It's a kind of a crazy story. We started on Zoom, then in a forest preserve, and we were sitting around one day, and there's just like 3 of us on staff at the very beginning, and we were like, we have all these students who've been doing school from home for a couple years, like, and now they're coming back to church. It's very disorienting. What do we do? And we were like, well, and I sat down with one of our students. He was 19 at the time. And he said, do you have any internships? And I was like, no, but sounds like a great idea. So there were 3 of us on staff in that first year. We had 11 interns, all ranging from the ages of like 16 to 24. Wow. And I feel like that really shaped our church. Like they weren't spectators, right? They were invested in the church, speaking into it. I mean, they were part of our services. And so that kind of DNA has continued. And that internship program for us has been one of the key ways that we get to hear voices. And we have a young adult community now too, but it's been a really powerful thing to not just have people who are like attending, but who are basically on staff and speaking into all the different ministries around the church. So
wow, that's really amazing. I mean, to have we talk about. I mean, our church also started during COVID, which is a crazy experience. Yeah. Here we are 5 years later, still kicking, which is pretty awesome. But we've talked a number of different times about like, what does it look like to have young people's voices in positions of like actually speaking into where are we going, what are we doing? Because we've noticed that like the younger generation of the church makes up a huge percentage of our church population. It's like. They're the ones. We gotta prep for them, and so I love that you're finding space to do that, and that means that there are opportunities for Gen Z to step in, for this new generation to step in and say like, here's what we're learning about the world, which oftentimes comes from almost like a hopeless perspective, not Gen Z's perspective in particular, but like where so much of that information comes from is like, man, this place is just falling apart. And instead to be able to take like, here's some of the realities that we're experiencing and to infuse it with the hope of the gospel and their excitement for intimate community and not just like, sometimes changing the world can feel like, oh, that's too big of a that's too big of a bite. Like let's boil it down to local. Like let's get intimate with the people in our community here. And what does it look like to have like world change effect on a across the street level? And it's amazing to be able to think about Gen Z being able to speak into church communities in that way, which sometimes can get very grand, and we can miss sort of the practical, our neighbors across the street kind of ministry. And that's amazing. And so then flip side of that, like what's something that you feel like, okay, and this is something that the church brings for Gen Z that they really need in this season of life?
Yeah. Well, this probably isn't going to come as a surprise. This term comes from Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, which I'm sure many of your listeners have either heard or read or familiar with. And he uses this term, and it's a friendship recession. And I really liked the way he phrased that.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's saying, obviously as a result of technology, and whether it's gaming for guys or social media for women, that we have these breadth of friendships, but not the depth of relationships and community. And obviously kind of the disembodied nature of connecting virtually versus in person, and just the lack of really deep human connection. And, just like, if there's a recession in the U.S. economy, the government does some things, right? They, lower interest rates or provide some jobs programs. I think actually what the church does is it doesn't solve the friendship problem or community problem, but it's a rich space where people are coming together looking for that. And it's not, and there are shared interests, but it's like a shared interest that's bigger than yourself, right? Like, how do we live out this faith? And so I think what the church offers is a place where people are coming together, trying to follow God the best they can. And it is a place people are looking for relationships. I mean, we just did a survey of our congregation, kind of preparing for the fall and what our groups are going to look like. And I mean, by far, I think over 80%, when they said, what are they looking for when it comes to groups? It was friendship, connection, finding a place where I can get to know people. And so I think for this next generation, the church is a fantastic place to find that community. And again, forget technology for a second. We're a more mobile community, and we move for jobs, and so you're away from maybe where you grew up and the friends you had in college. And so it's like, how do you make deep friends? Like, it's hard to make old friends, right? But we all want like old friends, people we can show up with, be ourselves, And I think the church is the place. It's just the perfect place to start. And it's hard too. I mean, it takes time, and it takes, trying different groups and getting used to different people's personalities. But I'm like, man, there's so much richness and depth in these relationships. And, I always joke that like the only things that are eternal are like, God, heaven, Jesus, and the people we're around. So like, let's invest in those.
Yes. Oh, I really appreciate that you just name, like, church doesn't solve the relationship problem, but it does create so many opportunities to explore relationships at a different level. Because, I mean, in particular for our alumni, they've come from a place where they have been rich in relationships with their peers, which is great. Like, there's something about walking through an experience with somebody who is also going through it. But then there's something really beautiful about being able to enter a multi-generational community.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, like, there's like a couple over there that's been married for 50 years. And while I may not like have a, midnight movie night with them on a Friday, it might be really great to go have dinner with them a couple of times a month if they're willing to host me, just so I can learn, like, what does lifelong relationship look like in this type of life, not just a school life, or, people with young kids, or peers that are also stepping in. You have all of these different opportunities, and young professionals and people that are experiencing the world just a couple steps ahead of them. And what a cornucopia of relationship opportunity that there is, that you might not find your, like, at least not immediately, you might not find your one absolute very best friend, but you might find a whole community of people that are ready to support you and to walk through this new season of life with you, and to teach you, what does it look like to do this life now that you are done with the college life? And there are so many opportunities there. And I think that is a fantastic space for people to step in, to take some risks, to be brave. It's gonna require some bravery, for sure. But I love that opportunity is there. Thinking about some of those things, like, are there just one or two like practical steps that you would encourage our young alumni to consider as they are investigating a church, or even still just wrestling with this early on question, like, seriously, is church worth waking up for? Should I even spend my time? Like, do you have a one or two practical steps that you would invite them into?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is actually just to go in knowing, like, hey, the first one may not be the perfect one, but it takes a little while, and like, it's okay if the first one or two isn't, and I would say too, the beauty we have right now is you get to check out churches online first, right? And so it's funny, even when I go to a website, we were in another city over spring break and I wanted to go visit a church, and I was like, and one of the things that grabbed my attention was when the church was like, oh, you can bring coffee in, which seems minor, but I was like, oh, okay, it's probably a little more casual and relaxed. I was like, that fits my vibe, Yeah. And so, I mean, there's just things you can kind of get from a website. Obviously, you can watch a service and just get a sense of like, who's there? What is this church like? And I think, we always talk about the lobby has moved from, in a physical church building to online. And so I think just checking out a few churches, and then honestly, bring a friend with you. It's like, it's just always uncomfortable to walk into a new space where you don't know anybody. Bring a friend. Sometimes I'll even say, hey, if there's a way to contact the church ahead of time and just say, hey, I'm looking for a church, I'd love to talk to somebody. I think and again, like, it depends on if you like to talk on the phone or email or whatever, but that's a way to just practically, check out churches. But I tell you too, like, it's so easy to walk into a church and then be a spectator. And like, I just want to encourage like your listeners, like, get in the game. And I think about, we talked about, you can rub shoulders with people of different generations, and that's awesome. And even if you're not like meeting with people, you're just around people with different kinds of life experience. Yeah. But also, I see we have a group, a 20s, 30s group, and several of them are serving in our like kids ministry, and our kids are so drawn to them. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I see them like after church running up to them and like wanting, kids wanting to show them their like Rubik's Cube and things like that. And I'm like, oh man, you have such an impact. And like, it's not just our kids and student ministries, but, greeting at the front door and really being a part of the church body. And I'm like, we need your voice, and we need your input and direction. And it's hard to do that off on the sides, like get in the game, and again, try some stuff out, but there's just, we want and need their impact.
Yes. And that, like, whether it's right or not, I will say that if you get involved at some level of like volunteering, it probably means that you have somebody who is like kind of supervising that space of which means you have a built-in person who's looking after you, like who's checking in and asking, like, hey, even if it's checking in to ask, like, hey, are you available this Sunday? A conversation has been started,
right?
and you can lean into that. And if your answer is yes, he's like, I'm super excited. Like, I would love to talk more about what it's been like, what my experience has been like, and like, can we grab some coffee, or with your fellow volunteers? Like, you have built-in space where there's a little bit of context that you can sort of build further relationship off of. And like you said, where you have an opportunity to speak in, which I would recommend early on to do very humbly and very thoughtfully. Right. because a lot of these things have been running for a while. They've found some sort of rhythm, and you might bring some new perspective to the table. But maybe give yourself a few times of volunteering before you necessarily throw a lot of critique or input out there. But like, you have built-in community already in your fellow volunteers right there, which is just amazing. Like, I love the fact that every Sunday we have a volunteer gathering before church starts, and so we sit down, we talk through important parts of the service, we mention prayer requests, we pray for each other, we have a moment of quiet just to like, let's just sit and recenter. And you have these built-in spaces to connect and to volunteer and to participate. And what an awesome just like jump start that gives you into church community right there, because you just immediately become one of us. Because you're here just doing this stuff with us, and that it's really it's really amazing. So I appreciate that invitation for sure of like, man, find a place to try stuff out. And if it doesn't work out the first time, it's okay. Like, it's all right. Okay. Just keep testing, keep trying. That's right. And I really appreciate that. Gina, along with some of these practical pieces of advice, I wonder, do you have just a final pastoral shepherding word of encouragement that you would give to alumni in this first year of life after graduation as they're asking big questions about getting involved in churches? Yeah.
I would just say, man, the church, like, we are in this together and we own the future of this church together. And so it is just show up and get involved, invest in church, and then like put down some roots. Like, again, the church will disappoint you. Leaders will disappoint you. And, with wisdom and humility, bring those things, to the surface, bring those things to light, talk to your pastors. We want to hear from you. And we're going to get it wrong too. But hopefully we're building this together. And again, and really it is, of course, it's God building his church, but he uses his people. And you can, and sometimes I have been in this place where it's so much easier to be a critic. I have been in that place where I get to I'm like, oh my gosh, why would they do this or say that or, run this that way? And, it's so much more fun to be on the inside. It's such an adventure. And like one of the things I love most about ministry is you really do get this front row seat of how God is working, not just in your life, but all of a sudden you see him in other people's lives, in the church, in kids, you just see him at work. And gosh, don't miss out on that. There's such an adventure out there. And the longer you stay away, the easier it kind of is. So I'd say in that first year after graduation, start looking, make it a priority, find a church and then invest and put down some roots. And man, I just get excited about the future of the church if we do that together.
So is church worth getting up for? I'm sure you already knew the answer that we would put out there was a resounding yes. But obviously, we also recognize the challenges. It's not as simple as just getting up and going and then everything is perfect. Like so many things in this season of life, connecting with a church takes time, it takes energy, and it takes grace for the church and for yourself, and a healthy spoonful of bravery and determination. And it's not just for your sake, alumni, it's for the church's sake. I hope you heard Gina loud and clear that you have so much to offer the church. Just as much as you need a community of people following Jesus, that same community needs you. Yes, church is worth getting up for because even though you will absolutely see each other at your worst, you can't be your best without one another. Gina, thank you so much for your time and investment in this next generation of alumni. I am so grateful for you. Alumni, be sure to come back next week as we wrap up our Big Question series by asking, how much is enough? Until then, consider sharing this episode with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Thanks for listening to After 4. This podcast is brought to you by the InterVarsity Alumni Relations Team, hosted and produced by John Steele, production assistance by Mike Santera, edited by Caleb Leppert, and our After 4 theme music was written and performed by John Steele.